With the resignation of former Fine Gael TD Eoghan Murphy comes the news of a Dáil by-election in the Dublin Bay South area. This by-election will be the first true electoral test for the three government parties and will most likely be a good way of gauging public opinion on the government's performance thus far, with housing being the clear national issue surrounding this election. But who are the candidates running and what do they stand for? In this series I'll be sitting down with as many of the candidates as possible to answer these very questions. Today I sat down with current Senator Ivana Bacik, who is contesting the by-election under the Labour Party banner, to talk about her prospective ambitions with regards to housing and then tackling some more local Dublin Bay South issues. Well, perfect. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Senator Ivana Bacik, who I've already mentioned as a current Labour Party Senator and the Labour Party spokesperson on children, disability, equality and integration. Now, obviously the by-election will be coming up at some stage or another in the next couple of months in Dublin Bay South. And I've obviously listed off maybe a few of a very small amount of the accolades that you have to your name. If sort of you're going towards the electorate and maybe some of them don't know who you are and they haven't heard of you before, how would you describe yourself and your values to them?
Well, first of all, Odhrán, thanks very much for inviting me along. Delighted to be speaking with you today. And yes, if I was asked just to introduce myself, as I often am, and during the by-election campaign, I'm sure I will be again, I would say I'm a Labour senator. I've been a senator for Trinity graduates since 2007, honoured to have been re-elected on 4 separate occasions. And during my time in the Seanad, I've sought to provide a progressive, left-wing feminist voice for radical change in Irish society. And I came to politics through my background in student activism in the late 80s, early 90s. I was threatened with prison for giving information on abortion to women in crisis pregnancy at a time when, of course, that was illegal. And, women's rights have really been a driving force for me in my politics ever since. So I think that's how I would introduce myself, Odhrán. I mean, I should have had, I'm also a mother of 2 teenage daughters living in Portobello, and my family home is here in Dublin Bay South in Rathgar. But I actually was born in London and spent my primary school years in Cork. We grew up in West Cork. So I came to Dublin then when I was 11 to school and have lived in Dublin Bay South pretty much ever since, apart from a few years spent in London post-graduation. It's an interesting feature of anyone in my generation in the late 80s. We all expected to emigrate. There were no jobs here, 20% unemployment. And and happily, many of us did come back after a few years. But it's really sad for me now and for my cohort to see another generation kind of feeling they're priced out of home ownership and the future for them may lie outside of Ireland. So that, to me, again, is a driving reason why I stay in politics, to try and make society better here, make it more progressive, provide better public services, housing, health, childcare, huge issue, and indeed elder care for people who are older. So those are the reasons I'm in politics.
Of course. Well, we'll come on to housing later because it has been sort of the main issue that's been described for this upcoming by-election on a national scale. And that's obviously no surprise given that the by-election seat is of a former housing minister in Eoghan Murphy. I want to first start off because, Dublin Bay South has been described by the Irish Times as a Fine Gael heartland for the most part. And, that's no surprise. They garnered 28% of the votes back in 2020 general election. And, it's the former constituency of the former Taoiseach, Gareth Fitzgerald. Given that the constituency now has no Fine Gael representative, what are you sort of offering to these 28% of voters that are maybe, to stop them maybe wanting to go for that Fine Gael sort of familiarity?
Well, first of all, I should say that it's a constituency that has had a long and proud history of electing very prominent individuals and legislators to the Dáil. So we've seen, for example, in 2011, it was a Labour stronghold. We held 2 out of 4 seats then. My good friends and comrades, Rory Quinn and Kevin Humphreys, both elected for Labour in 2011. So indeed, there's a strong Labour tradition in this constituency. Rory held that seat for 3 decades. And, that's an extraordinary achievement. And I suppose it's testament to the huge work he did and the huge esteem in which he was held by so many people in the constituency. So to say it's a Fine Gael stronghold, I think it's a constituency where people like to have strong, articulate voices represent them in the Dáil, and that actually party affiliation may be less of a maybe less of a primary motivator than is often assumed, because you can see it switched from, Labour, Fine Gael, of course there's now currently a Fianna Fáil and a Green TD, so we have two government TDs representing the constituency, and indeed a Sinn Féin TD. So you could say that what's lacking actually is a strong opposition voice, and of course what is also very glaringly lacking is a strong woman's voice in the constituency. So it was, I think, a surprise for many of us when we returned last year 4 men to the Dáil. So that's, and that's not in keeping with the spirit of this, what I would describe as very liberal constituency. And I mean liberal in a very positive sense, socially liberal, but also economically, I think, driven by a strong regard for social democracy. And Rory encapsulated that in his many years representing this constituency. So I don't think that the Fine Gael tie is quite as strong, perhaps, as some political commentators suggest.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to touch on housing because obviously you mentioned it earlier, and it is going to be a huge topic coming up in this by-election, and that's no surprise given the most recent ESRI report. It has been reported, you were quoted in the Irish Independent saying that this government is failing. It has no common purpose, and never is this more evident than in relation to housing. Now, I suppose the counter argument to a lot of these points will be made by obviously the current housing minister, Darragh O'Brien. One of the big counterpoints will be that over the last year, this government has only been formed surrounding the COVID pandemic and has to deal with a lot of the outfall of that, and we can debate all day whether they did a good job on that or not, and that's a completely different conversation in itself. But obviously Minister Darragh O'Brien welcomed the approval of the Affordable Housing Bill back of 2021 back on May 4th, which was the first comprehensive standalone legislation dedicated to the provision of social housing. Surely from that perspective, to a passive person looking in at how legislation is going through the Dáil, surely this is a big step for a government that has had quite a difficult time getting its bearings. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone would underestimate the enormous impact of COVID. I mean, it's so patently obvious, the devastation and heartbreak it's caused for so many around the world, and here in Ireland, loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, huge impact on health for those who survived COVID too. So, I absolutely agree. That has to have been, for the last year, the pressing priority for any government that was in office. But where I would be highly critical of this government is the fact that, in fact, it's pretty much the same parties who have been in power since 2016. And between 2016 and 2020, Fine Gael, and don't forget, Fine Gael were in government only because Fianna Fáil were supporting them in this sort of strange arrangement they had, the Memorandum of Understanding. So we had effectively a Fine Gael Fianna Fáil coalition between 2016 and 2020. And for those 4 years, there was no action on housing, no significant action on housing. And those are 4 wasted years. It's 5 years on now, of course, but you can say specifically those 4 wasted years where there was a notable lack of urgency in government decision-making on housing. And don't forget, that was at a time when the public finances were really strong. The outgoing government that left office in 2016 had turned the economy around from a point in 2011 when we were bankrupt as a country, when the IMF and the Troika had come in, and people don't really need to be reminded, but the economic fortune had turned around by 2016, and we were in a position where Labour, leaving in 2016, had put in place a major social house building programme, which unfortunately was squandered then by Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil for the 4 years that intervened. So that's where I would be highly critical of the current parties in government. The 2 big parties in government, that they didn't really invest in public housing when they should have. And of course, that's why they didn't do well in the February 2020 general election. I mean, again, COVID has sort of overwhelmed everything since, but that's why the government parties didn't do as well as they had expected in that last general election, is because they failed on housing. And, I think people recognise that. So it's welcome. So you ask about the affordable housing bill. Yes, of course, it's welcome to see the government now belatedly picking up a little bit of more momentum on it. However, clearly, the bill hasn't addressed the fundamental problem, which is lack of supply. And which requires to be addressed through the provision of significant public money in order to build. Our Labour manifesto commitment last year was 80,000 houses over 5 years. That's the sort of commitment we need to see, social and affordable housing alongside private development as well. And that's what's so severely lacking. And my colleague Senator Rebecca Moynihan, who's our housing spokesperson, been very critical of aspects of the affordable housing bill. But of course, but all of us welcome the fact that we now do have housing legislation for sure, but it just doesn't go far enough. And then you couple that with the fact that, you know, for those wasted 4 years, what we saw was tax breaks to those who were developing hotels, student accommodation, huge issue in my area, Dublin Bay South. You know, a lot of build to rent developments, huge one just a few streets away from me in Portobello, and people then being priced out. You know, I've described walking through Mount Argus and Harold's Cross, which is again a giant, beautiful apartments. Looking in the window, fully furnished, empty apartments, plastic sheeting still on the mattresses, and people crying out for housing and not able to afford the rents that these places are charging. So that's really where I think we can all be highly critical of the government, and that's where we do need to see an alternative put forward.
Of course, yeah. The main, at least particularly with young people, has been the sort of reliance on private investors in order to get housing off the ground. And, you know, you mentioned that there's a lack of supply. Is there sort of, you know, and, you know, you adequately mentioned, and fair enough as well, that, you know, obviously the 2011 to 2016 government didn't have enough money to be pumping loads and loads of money into housing at the time, and I think it's a fair point to say that the 4 years were squandered by the previous government with regards to this. But are we not in a similar situation now? You know, COVID has kind of gutted the economy at the current stage as well, and we're going to be on a very, I'm not going to say austerity measures again, but it certainly is pointing in that direction given the current stature of the government. Is it not, you know, who is going to be paying for these high levels of social housing if we don't, you know, allow private investors at least to, you know, build more housing, and in turn would then drastically reduce the prices of rent?
Well, first of all, I mean, clearly the reliance on the private investment funds and the REITs and so on hasn't delivered on housing construction, even in pre-COVID. That you know, hasn't delivered. I mean, many of the developments we're talking about now, like Mount Argus, I'm just throwing that out there, you know, as a one example, or indeed the development that's now been constructed on just off Camden Street in here in Portobello. These developments were already in train before COVID, so you know that's one can't suggest that it was COVID that has limited the capacity of the private sector to deliver. Clearly, it was the wrong policy to rely so heavily on investment funds to deliver private housing. It just hasn't worked, and they haven't delivered. And the housing they have delivered, much of it, as I've described, is sitting empty at unaffordable rent. So it's not the housing that we need, or the accommodation or apartments that we need. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, in fact, you know, any economic commentator, and I'm thinking of people like David McWilliams, you know, in the Times, or indeed Aidan Regan in the Business Post, you know, economic commentators are agreed that that while clearly, you know, COVID has been a massive burden financially as well as in a human level on the state, it's a very, very different economic scenario to that which pertained in 2011 following the economic crash of 2008. What we're seeing now is not a collapse in demand or consumer demand. It's simply a suspension of demand. You know, while shops weren't open, nobody could shop. I walked down Grafton Street last night. I live very close to it. The feeling of people out, happy to spend. There's a sizable proportion of our population happily that have been able to continue working and earning through the pandemic, and who have had nothing to spend on. So I think we're all conscious that there's a very, very different economic scenario. We're not, and you know, right and left are agreed on this. There's no prospect of return to austerity measures. This is a very, very different economic context. You know, that once public health restrictions lift, the economy will reopen, and the pent-up demand will clearly be exercised. And we're seeing it in other countries like Britain, of course, where they're ahead of us on the vaccine rollout. So that's a huge change. And the other huge change is, of course, the EU context, the fact that the EU is no longer pushing austerity as a policy, and indeed is encouraging public spending, and that we have zero interest rates. So our state can now borrow at zero to fund the building of a massive public housing program. I'm comparing it much more to the 1922, the huge building program that the very new, very broke Irish Free State embarked upon. I can see it all around me in the 10s. You know, an awful lot of the housing stock here was built in that period. Or indeed the creation of the NHS and the welfare state in Britain after World War II, when the state just stepped in, despite the huge crisis and the huge financial difficulty it was going through. The state steps in. There's a point at which public spending must be just let out. You know, that there's no time for fiscal restraint now. What we need is to ensure that those young people who should be, in fact, you know, pushing our economy, that they're actually encouraged to stay here because the housing stock is available for them to buy, the apartments, the houses, and so on. So it's an investment rather than a cost, you know.
I want to bring it back a little bit to the ESRI report because it's going to shape the public conversation surrounding this, I believe, for the next couple of weeks or months. It was kind of laid out in the Irish Times again that 60% of people born in the 1960s either lived in their home or owned a home with their partner before the age of 30. And this is almost half to only 32% of people born early 1980s. And I'm sure it's gone down since then. And the standard of living for millennials in their 20s and 30s is likely to be the first generation in Ireland to have a lower standard of living than those in the previous generation. You know, Labour have obviously outlined a lot of stuff in their 2020 manifesto about affordable housing. But as you say, is it singularly the most important bit about getting this demand up, or are there other small bits that can be done by the Labour Party if you are elected to try and increase, to make sure that it isn't any worse for people trying to get housing?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a number of other measures, of course, that need to be brought in. Although, I would stress, and Rebecca has certainly stressed that, that delivering supply is the biggest thing that the state should now be doing, and that should be the focus, not tweaking at the edges and so on. But I think the other big piece that needs to be delivered, and again, which is lacking in the government's bill, or in the government's ideology really, is protection for renters. So security of tenure is a huge thing for us in Labour. Tenants' rights, I mean, it's a topic that has a long resonance in Irish society. James Connolly, the founder of our party, was so strong on the rights of tenants. And of course, previous generations always rented. In fact, home ownership is, as you said, it's a relatively new aspiration for generations. Certainly my grandmother, her, and my mother indeed was brought, they would have been brought up in rented housing or housing that was tied to an employer. So it's a newer concept. So we shouldn't forget that for many people, renting remains the way in which they fund their own accommodation, and therefore we should be delivering stronger tenancy rights and security of tenure. And that again is an important way of ensuring that people feel secure in their homes, and also then that they feel if you have security of tenure, if you have a fair rents approach, then people aren't quite as pressed about needing to buy because they're seeing huge amounts of money flying out on rent and they're afraid of the landlord putting up the rent. So many people I know, that's what drove them into buying a house, perhaps before they could really even afford it. And this is my generation. So this isn't a new phenomenon that you rush into a mortgage because you're so scared in rental accommodation that you simply won't be able to afford the next hike in rent that the landlord imposes. So I think that's very important, that we need to be giving security of tenure, some certainty about rent, about fixing rent. And the COVID pandemic has shown us we can do that because, of course, we've brought in under emergency legislation bans on evictions. That's really positive, So now we've been told for years, the successive Attorney General is saying property rights are too strong in the Irish Constitution to allow this. But actually, if it's a proportionate response, I've taken constitutional cases, a lot of the issue for the Supreme Court is looking at whether legislation represents a proportionate response to a threat. We see lack of housing as a crisis. It's a proportionate response to put in rent controls.
Of course. Just before we finish, I'd like to touch on some local issues first, because I'm sure whilst the people of Dublin Bay South, generally appreciate the severity of national issues such as the housing crisis, many will be sort of wondering what a new TD in the area can offer them on a local level. Obviously, I've seen you've been online recently. You've been maintaining a close working relationship with Councillor Kevin Donoghue in the Dublin South East inner city constituency. And the most recent controversy I think everyone saw online was the closure of Portobello Plaza, which I think for some reason has taken storm online. It kind of drew a lot of criticism, particularly in the Dublin region, as to the lack of outdoor areas for people to engage in safe, social distance conversations, whatnot, and in general, and just Dublin facilities in general. I know even before this conversation, there was a huge lack of public toilets and everything, and people were really disgruntled about the fact that you'd have to either go into Stephen's Green and pay money to go into the bathrooms, or you were kind of just, get the train home. So what can be sort of done to ensure that more open, safe areas are made available in the public in Dublin Bay South?
Well, first of all, Portobello Harbour or Plaza is it is a very contentious issue. It's very difficult. I mean, what had been happening there over a number of weekends was a lot of crowds gathering, people having nowhere else to go, but then it becoming late at night a magnet, unfortunately, for some very, very tricky behaviour, some behaviour that was really threatening to a lot of local residents. So I know for local residents, it couldn't have continued the way it was. And, I live here in Portobello, so I know this very well. On the other, and so there was a meeting between council officials and local residents, and my good friend and comrade, Councillor Kevin Donoghue, our Labour councillor in the area, was at that meeting. Now, the council, in the end, the agreement was a short-term agreement coming out of that meeting, which was to try and address the residents' concerns about late night behaviour and, threat and so on. That they would, the council would close off the harbour area, the plaza area at the harbour for a weekend. Now, Kevin objected to that, I think rightly, on the basis that this isn't a sustainable solution, and he and I absolutely agree on this, that we need to find a longer term solution. And he's actually proposed what I think is a great idea, which is that it would operate as a public park. In other words, it'd be open during the day, but would have a particular evening time where it could be closed off. And I think that's a reasonable compromise, particularly, again, Odhrán, this is, there's two other things that make this not a permanent issue in the case of Portobello Harbour. One is, of course, that hospitality is currently closed. Normally, there's actually a whole load of pubs and restaurants around the area, which in fact absorb people who are socialising. Yeah. So this won't be a factor, I think, beyond June to the same extent. We had it last summer, by the way, and I worked with local guards and so on, and we reached a good compromise about policing that was, that was proportionate and reasonable. And the guards were very fair to people and recognised people need some public space. So anyway, so I'm disappointed, frankly, that the council are closing it for another 3 weekends. I think, but I accept that at the same time, it had become very difficult for local people. People were, urinating publicly. There was an awful lot of noise, and as I say, some aggressive behaviour. My own teenage girls did not feel safe walking through. So, one has to balance these things. But I think longer term, we do need to find a way of maintaining our civic spaces, including Portobello Harbour, open, providing the public toilets you describe. We do it at Croke Park, actually, on match days. The council drops in these great big, portaloos and public urinals. Let's just do that. Absolutely. Let's facilitate an outdoor summer and outdoor life. But Portobello Harbour did unfortunately become a magnet for a lot of controversy. The council solution is only short term, and longer term, Kevin and I are going to work with the council officials and guards and residents to ensure that we can keep the harbour open, at least during the day. And on a broader level, I've also been talking about trying to get more open spaces for people in the area. In particular, I'm working with some of the local GAA clubs because there's a huge problem, no playing fields for Ranelagh Gaels, which is a big and growing local GAA club. So I've been lobbying Minister Coveney, the Defence Minister, as well as Foreign Affairs, to try and open up Cattlebrewer Barracks playing fields, which are available for limited times for usage by local clubs, but which are lying vacant. I've been in there with my own kids, and it's an awful waste of space in the middle of Rathmines. So we're trying to work on that, and indeed, to develop Dublin Bay. I had a swim this morning in the bay, Poolbeg. A lot of us started swimming there through the lockdown and all through the winter. And it's a fantastic amenity on our doorstep, totally underdeveloped for public recreational use, and yet people are flocking there now. It's so beautiful all along before you even get to Sandyman Strand, Poolbeg and the nature reserve at Irish Town. It's just phenomenal, the South Bull Wall. So, we're looking at how we can develop that better for local people.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for all your time, and hopefully we'll get to chat again closer to the election itself. If you enjoyed this interview and you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with all future uploads. With that being said, my name is Odhrán Johnson, and you've been watching Media.wmv's Dublin Bay South by-election interview series.